and welcome to the Authors Talk Show. I'm your host, Alexis Monahan, and I'm here with author Lucille Griswold to talk about her books. Good morning, Lucille.
Good morning, Alexis.
Good to see you.
Same here.
Let's start out with your most recently published book, which is Generations Apart.
Right.
On your website, you introduced this novel saying that rules change from one generation to another. You say that advice is given in a past period can seem totally out of whack in the present-day society. Can you give us some general examples of what you mean by this?
Well, a couple. For example, if a woman had been raped years ago, you wouldn't dare report it to the police. You wouldn't report it to anybody. And then the advice that they give you might be horrible. Today, there are rules on the books that tell you just where to go to get the police. They have women there. They take tests. They take DNA. And on the lighter side, my mother-in-law couldn't even get a credit card when her husband died a few years ago. This is not that long ago. And young people today think it's so easy because they're at the college campuses and stuff.
Yeah.
But she had a credit card while he was alive, but as soon as he died, that was it. So those are just a couple of examples.
So what inspired you to write about this topic?
Well, I worked with, at Montgomery College, I was working with young teenagers, 16, 17 years old. And they didn't seem to know, they took for granted, well, I can get a credit card, I can do this, I can do that, and they didn't even appreciate the fact that they could vote, for example. And it dawned on me, well, maybe I can make a story and see how things were different in the past to teach them a little lesson.
Okay, so let's go a little more into detail about that story.
Okay.
The book starts out with a couple, John and Susan Harrison. Can you give us an idea about them, their age, how long they've been married, etc.?
Yeah, they've been married a long time. I didn't focus on their age, and the reader can decide if they're in their late 40s, late 50s, even as early 70s. That I didn't want that to be so much the focus of the story, but they've been married a long time. They're very much in love still, and we go from there.
So in the synopsis of your story, we learned that something happened to Susan earlier on in her life.
Yes,
without giving too many spoilers away, can you tell us a bit about what happened to her?
Yes, something horrible does happen to her, and that was bad enough, what happened to her, but the advice that was given to her by her mother, for one, and by the college campus where she was going to school, was totally out of whack of what they would do today. And consequently, she suffered this. It haunted her throughout her marriage, this advice, this poor advice.
That's a very important topic to keep discussing, Lucille. Thank you. We'll keep talking with Lucille after this very short commercial break. We'll be right back.
It's Jax Tarina, hostess of Flip TV. I'd like you to know that you can read some of the best articles about nearly anything that interests you in our Flip magazine publication. With two sides directed to guys on one side and ladies on the other, there's plenty to keep both of you interested. And sneak peek on the other side, right? Check out Flip Magazine today at flipmagazine.net. And you can learn what's new and what's coming up by following us on social media at The Flip Magazine. You'll love it.
Welcome back to the Authors Talk Show. We're here continuing our discussion with Lucille Griswold on her novel Generations Apart. So Lucille, it seems pretty on in the story that our main characters encounter another family, George and Lauren. How did they impact the story?
Well, they have a great impact because John and Susan had been alone for quite a while. And then something happens to this family and her son and his family, and they move in. And I did this to mimic real life because, and I want young people to understand too, that things don't always go as you plan. Mm-hmm. So it's how you handle the unexpected that really trains you to be a good individual or not. So that's why I put this story in, just to make things a little harder.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, by the way. Are there multiple generations represented in this story?
Definitely, because Susan is one of many sisters, and they're younger. She's I believe the oldest. I can't even remember my own book, but so they're very much into the new things that we have today, and sometimes they get in trouble too.
Okay. As you've explored this aspect of generation differences, do you feel that it has impacted one gender over another?
That's a good question. I think most of the rules impact women more so, but it also has a double impact on a man because he's got to learn to change his thinking. I mean, men used to give cat calls and say sexy things, and it was just the way they did it. And now if they do that, they'll get in trouble. You have sexual harassment laws, so it impacts them both really, but most of the laws seem to favor women.
And what sort of criteria do you think societies and new generations use to make these new rules as they grow?
Well, I think it starts out with a simple showing concern. Let's go back to slavery, for example. People realized that some of them were getting abused and slapped around and treated horrendously. And so people begin to see that this is not the way to handle these things. And then they either, years ago we used to write letters, they march, and this stuff still goes on today, and now you have the media, so that's really the last resort, and that's the most effective. And Facebook and Twitter and those things.
The 24-hour media coverage of everything that happens.
Exactly.
Very true. And in your book, or just in general from life, what do you think the challenges are for the older generations as they see these changes happening to the young?
Yes, a lot of them find it very hard to accept. I feel I've been fortunate in working with young students because they've helped me to think a little bit younger. But the older people, sometimes they're too rigid in their thinking, and this causes a lot of problems because they can't accept it's my way or no way, and it can be harmful.
Yes. And in general, what are you hoping that readers take away after reading Generations Apart?
Well, mostly I hope they enjoy it, but I always give little subtle lessons in the book, and I hope they catch those too.
Well, I know I certainly enjoyed reading your book, Lucille.
Great.
And we'll be right back after this short commercial break to discuss more of Lucille's novels.
That's good.
Throughout our lives, we make thousands of connections. Some fade, while others influence our lives in profound ways. This is a story of 7 interconnected individuals. Connected by a girl named Helen. Orphaned at age 13, she is forced to grow up quickly in the 1940s. Grow with her and become one of her connections. Caught between Heaven and Helen. Now available at rsplaunchpad.com.
Welcome back to the Authors Talk Show. We're still here with author Lucille Griswold, about to talk about her other novels that she's written. So Lucille, you've written a book also titled Life Lived in Reverse. That's a really fascinating title. Can you tell us a bit whose life is lived in reverse?
That's about me.
Oh.
And I wrote it when I was, one way I lived life in reverse is I started college at the normal age and then I finished it much later.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was in reverse, for one thing. And I was studying about women in college and how the hardships they had to endure. And it made me get interested in my own background, and my professor suggested I look into my heritage, and it ended up being a memoir. And so someone asked if they could publish it, and I asked the professor if they looked like they were legitimate, and she said yes. So we went from there.
So in the story, you talk about yourself being a military spouse
Right.
during the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And can you give us a sense of some of those struggles that you had back then?
Well, it was not a popular war, and if your husband was a professional, as mine was, like a doctor or a dentist, they went by themselves. So you didn't have a group around you to support you. You were left on your own, and you often didn't want to say anything about it because we used to get these phone calls from weirdos that said scary things, and so we tried to keep it secret, but it didn't always work out that way.
Now, do you think it's different today with the wars we're in today and being a military spouse? Do you think the struggles are still the same?
The struggles are not the same, but they're probably equally as hard in a different way. The young ones, they'll send a whole battalion, and but they have Skype, which we didn't have. So, and our husbands went away for a full year, and we couldn't talk to them, maybe by ham radio, once or twice during that time. Where today they Skype nearly every night, and they go for 6 months at a time. But I'm sure their hardships are equally as hard.
Yeah. Big differences in communication for sure, which I'm sure helps
Yes.
them.
Right.
Now moving on to poetry that you've written. You've written Grandmother's Jewels. Obviously poetry is very different than writing novels.
Right.
What have you found to be the differences? Which one's easier for you?
I think I would have to say the novel is easier. It takes a lot of thought to create a poem, whether it rhymes or whether it doesn't. But it's enjoyable, and when I did it, it's because I didn't have a lot of time, so the short version of the poem seemed to fit everything just fine.
Yeah. And so what is next for you, Lucille? Do you see yourself writing more books, more novels?
Absolutely. It's like it helps me to relax. I can get involved in my own stories, and just finding the time to do it, that's the hard part. But I am writing, constantly writing.
That's great. Well, we look forward to reading what you have to come out still.
Good. I hope so.
And I want to thank you for being with us today. We've come to the end of our show, but thank you for sitting down and talking to us.
My pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you. And that's the end of our show for the Authors Talk Show. I hope you enjoyed listening to Lucille Griswold. You can see more on her website, lucillegriswold.com.